stop? He's like, you don't need to stop. I'll stop you when you need to stop. So I'm sitting there. Keep that hay going in there.
Being 1 o'clock, I'll call the Executive Committee of the Marathon County Board of Supervisors to order, please. And we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And we will proceed with public comment. Does anybody wish to address the Executive Committee? No one has approached me, and it doesn't look like we have any members from the public here. So we will proceed on. Before we get to the approval of the Executive Committee meeting minutes, I want to I know there was a little bit of concern as to why the meeting got changed at the last minute. One of the things that that I also chair the NCHC Executive Committee. And the NCHC is in the process of recruiting its next executive director. And we have a meeting that's conflicts with the Executive Committee tomorrow at 3 o'clock. And it's critical for NCHC's future. And so I felt that it was that important that we had to move the Executive Committee of Marathon County to a different time, and I apologize for the late change, but there was, like I said, it's critical for NCHC's future and the future potential executive director. And I will try to get and then the other thing, there was one supervisor on the Executive Committee that had a request, and it's a timely, and it's a request that is critical. I should say it was time sensitive in the fact that it's something that pertains to the budget this year, and wanted to get it on the agenda and have a discussion. Unfortunately, the supervisor that had requested that was unable to attend today's meeting because of the change in time. And I apologize to that supervisor also for that, but we will still have those discussions. So thank you for indulging me, and we'll move on to item number 4, and that's the approval of the Executive Committee meeting minutes from the July 14th, 2022 meeting. What is your pleasure? Motion by Supervisor Langenhan and second by Supervisor Boots. Is there any discussion on the meeting minutes as presented in the packet? Seeing none, all those in favor of that motion to approve those meeting minutes of the July 14th Executive Committee meeting signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Say no. Motion is carried and is unanimous. Thank you. And we'll move on to education presentation and committee discussion. Again, this is a following, looking at the strategic plan and potential updates to the strategic plan. The vice chair was going to be here, and I have not heard anything to the contrary, but we'll go around and have a discussion with the chairs of the standing committees that have done some of the work. And there was in the packet, there are some suggestions that came from the Infrastructure Committee as far as the changes. John, I know you also serve on the Infrastructure Committee. If you want to at least go over, I don't have the chair or even the vice chair, unfortunately, from the Infrastructure Committee, but if you want to just highlight some of the changes that are actually in the packet. I know I caught you off guard around that, but I apologize. Like I said, the vice chair and the chair is not here.
I'm trying to get my parking to work.
Ah,
It would be nice if we could get parking.
I've got it up on the,
So we actually met a couple times through this We tweaked the goal on striving to provide affordable, reliable, high-speed internet access to support the task force in executing continued comprehensive approach to delivering countywide high-speed internet access with particular focus on addressing un- and underserved areas. And then we modified an earlier version to develop incentives to work with carriers to do that. Other changes, we changed the timing. I thought in committee we had changed that to the inventory to 20. Yeah, we did do it to 2022.
Yep, the inventory,
And then reflected in there to try to get an inventory of services available with the goal of serving 85% of the households. And then the others are maintain infrastructure to support economic development, support technology in the workplace and home. The committee eliminated one of the strategies, I think, dealing with local governments. I'm going to just go to the highlighted ones, and the final one was eliminate, staff report to the infrastructure committee relative to the feedback through the municipal leaders on safety concerns in the county highway and multimodal transportation systems following quarterly safety meetings. There was a goal in there that we reduce accidents by 5%. We didn't think that that was meaningful or measurable, so it was changed to reflect this language. So I think those were the healthy discussion at committee level.
okay. Any, Supervisor Boots?
You hear me?
Yep.
So we went through ours yesterday also. We're objective 7.1. And basically what we looked at is strategy A. I don't know, does everyone have that in front of them, I assume? Anyway, so A and B and C, we're looking at possibly getting rid of B. We're adding some strategies as far as reduce recidivism and staffing. So I don't know if the people know, but our staffing in our jail right now is
Critical.
extremely shorthanded. In fact, we have 83 inmates being shipped out because of our lack of staffing. So at that point, it's becoming a issue as far as following through on our objective 7.1. We're looking at the possibly putting in the regional forensic science center. I'm saying as a positive, is as far as the strategy is to add to that. And I know, like we had some of the discussion went like it kind of some overlap as far as staffing, but I think that's okay because I think that's huge for our county right now. Anyway, staffing is an issue all over the board. So maybe if it's in more than one objective, it's going to be showing that we need to focus on this a little more than we possibly have in the future. So we're going to have something. I just actually talked with Administrator Leonard today, and he's going to put in I said I would do the draft, and of course he's going to do the draft. And he will send us out a draft to look through with his notes that he had during the meeting yesterday. And we should have something for this body by next meeting.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Langenhahn, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The ERC did not discuss the strategic plan at their last meeting, primarily due to a healthy agenda load. However, the preliminary discussions that took place in the month prior, we don't anticipate our objectives changing or the strategies changing that much. We may be adding a strategy, and we will probably be changing some of our outcome measures after our staff does a little bit more reflection and reviews the data. So you'll hear more from the ERC for next month.
Okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, with the HHS, we have 3.3, 3.7, and 7.2. We went through what the email stated with the working draft of the strategic plan that Lance put out. on July 4th, and with 3.3, 2 of them were completed. We mostly spent our time talking about any changes, keeping the completed or continuing on with things, the improved percentage on the outcome measures. We decided we were going to need some changes. So we kind of brainstormed at our last meeting, and Michelle Van Cray and myself will sit down next week and pull together all the notes from the brainstorming and then bring it back to the committee for approval at our next meeting on August 31st.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Supervisor, please.
Yeah, at EEED, we did go through 8.7 with infrastructure, and we did pass that an unanimous vote to accept 8.7 as it was written. And then we are going through 10.6, 10.8, and 10.10. Some of the committee members did not get through the July 4th email from Lance, so hopefully by the next meeting we can kind of wrap this up. So thank you.
Okay. Supervisor Robinson?
And from the Human Resource and Finance and Property Committee, we're a committee without a strategy. So we just are secondary to a number of them. We're continuing to review them. That doesn't mean we're not strategic, Matt. We're very strategic in what we do. So we are also in the process of developing a committee work plan, which may reflect parts of the strategic plan, but we're in that process yet.
Okay, anything from administration? Lance, any thoughts? Again, I thank each of the chairs for their diligence in continuing the work on this. The hope is that we have some kind of recommendation that will go potentially to the full board for approval at some future point.
The only thing I'll add, Mr. Chair, as Supervisor Seefeld alluded to, there's actually one supervisor that is going to be working with Deputy Administrator Holman on a couple of the objectives, that Supervisor Seefeld referenced that are under the purview of the Extension Education Economic Development Committee to essentially put that draft together for further committee discussion, similar to the approach being taken at Health and Human Services, where Chair Van Cray and Vice Chair Arsted are going to meet to undertake that same sort of activity. And as Public Safety Chair Boots referenced, I will have that draft to him by the end of the day tomorrow based on my notes from the meeting.
All right. Any additional comments or questions from the committee? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on to item number 6. Operational functions required by statute, ordinance, or resolution, and there is none. And we'll move on to item number 7, policy issue for discussion and possible action, a follow-up on the administrator's work plan. And there's 3 items under the work plan. One, a prioritization of each of the projects on the work plan, potential additions to the work plan, and a possible detail. This is where the one supervisor's request comes in, a potential possibility of a detail of cost for each department based on statutory requirements and level of service. And then third, potential deletions from the work plan. So first, maybe I and the administrator had a discussion and in light of a couple of things, and think that a 1-year work plan is probably unrealistic, especially with the number of items that we have on that work plan. And some of those items on that work plan are longer term in vision. And I'll give you one example. In one example, we're looking at potentially new highway facilities, potential joint facilities. And that is something that's long-term and is not something that's going to be accomplished in 1 year. So the thought is that we look at something the more strategic in a 5-year work plan and putting some dates and times to those. And so I think that would be better reflective of what's actually totally happening. Lance, you got comments on those thoughts?
Sure. So as Chair Gibbs referenced to, essentially the chair asked me to look through the work plan and see what, when you as a committee are looking to prioritize that work plan, maybe give additional information to you to aid in that exercise by looking at what really could maybe is better characterized on a 5-year work plan. So just a couple quick thoughts in that regard, and then certainly I'll listen to the discussion and try to take some notes in terms of what you're looking for in terms of staff performance. But first on page, the first page, we really are talking about facilities work. And item C, this idea of a long-term facilities plan, as Chair Gibbs referenced, there's a lot of facilities work that's being done, but the idea of a single document capturing where we are, where we're going, and charting a path to get there, I would say it's highly unlikely based on current staff demands in terms of your other priority projects, that's going to be able to get done this year anyway. So perhaps that's something we can put on to that 5-year work plan. Certainly that doesn't mean, and I don't mean to leave you with the impression that we're not moving forward on those facility projects that we're already doing. We are working very diligently to relocate departments off of River Drive. We have had the discussions, as I allude to in the notes, about the Aging Disability Resource Center of Central Wisconsin returning to the North Central campus and what that might look like. And as Chair Gibbs referenced, we did recently get some direction from the Infrastructure Committee relative to next steps for staff for a potential future joint facility with the Highway Department and other departments. But the idea of a global document being completed by the end of the year, I think is perhaps unreasonable and would be better captured on a 5-year work plan. Similarly, the effort with respect to the library on page 3, item E, to identify a use for the 3rd floor. An ARPA project request came in from the library director on that project, so that really can be kind of moved forward to 2023. That would be appropriate in my estimation. Looking then at the evaluation of our current our current vehicle leasing program on page 7, with the relocation of several departments to the Lakeview campus, it, in my mind, makes the potential cooperation with North Central Healthcare on that larger fleet potential more meaningful. And as Chair Gibbs referenced at the start of the meeting with the recruitment for the executive director, the future executive director, perhaps that's something that if you're looking to prioritize, it could be moved down the list and captured on that 5-year work plan. Similarly, the telecommunications audit, I think we have a lot of opportunity there on page 8, but it is not from an administration perspective, a top priority in terms of operations. The evaluation of the university year projects from the justice system on page 10. Again, I don't think, if you're asking my perspective on what really are priorities, I don't know that the evaluation is something that, in light of everything else you have, that from a staff perspective, we would need that direction. However, it's certainly, again, up to you. The evaluation of revenues at juvenile detention, as Public Safety Chair Boots referenced, we're currently in the midst of some challenges with recruiting corrections officers that has led to juvenile detention not being operational. In light of that fact, I don't know that evaluating the revenues, particularly recent revenues, is really overly meaningful. So perhaps that could be something that you would put on a longer-term timeline in terms of when you want to complete that. Conducting a needs assessment relative to countywide emergency medical service response. Perhaps a suggestion, if you want to put that to further down, if it's not a priority, there is an option to fund that through the 2023 budget in terms of funding an RFP for a consultant to do that examination. That might free up some bandwidth for other priority projects if you do have any. And then lastly, and I noted this in my last update to the annual work plan, the comprehensive municipal code revision or county ordinance revision project. Perhaps a recommendation if that was something if you're looking to be mindful of staff resources and it's still a priority for you to move forward. A potential avenue to do that might be to form a task force or a work group of board members, and then you could essentially assign out to the appropriate standing committee various code provisions for the standing committee to review with staff liaisons that perhaps have more bandwidth than your HR department and your finance department and legal department. We can be a little bit more mindful of those resources. But those were just some comments that in light of the chair's request of me to provide you additional information as you start the prioritization process that I could come up with based on kind of what we're looking at internally. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Questions? Supervisor Langenhahn, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lance, is the plan to put that EMS study as part of your 2023 budget?
That would be my recommendation. Because again, I don't know that staff have the capacity right now to do it, and there's no funding in the 2022 budget for it. So it would either be, if you wanted to prioritize it to move forward this year, we would need to identify a funding source within the 2022 budget and allocate the funds necessary to do that, get the RFP out and engage that consultant. Otherwise, if you'd like to address that in the 2023 budget timeframe or later, you could provide me that direction as a committee, particularly public safety, provide me that direction, and I will put it in the budget if it's for 2023 or make special note of it for a later year.
Thank
Supervisor
you,
Mask.
Thank you, Lance.
Supervisor Mask, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't think that is a priority because of the cost. And I know that emergency management is going to keep us updated on what what he can find out from those responses. But that was one thing we crossed off the list. At least I crossed off my list because of the cost. And I don't think that it would be worth the money to go into that study right now. Thank you.
Supervisor Langenhahn, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't want to have the policy discussion about whether or not to have that study because I believe public safety is responsible for that. I will just comment, though, when we have communities that have 20 to 30-minute response times, I think we do at least owe them the opportunity to view what a countywide feasibility study would look like. I'm not saying that it has to be done now this year. I'm just asking a question whether or not it could be a part of the 2023 budget. Thank you.
Supervisor Robinson.
The governor just released some money for, I thought, studying this. Do we know what those timelines are for EMS services?
Supervisor Boots.
We do not, but we can get those numbers. I was not aware of that, so we could look into that. And
So I think that should drive our time frame. If they're time sensitive and there's an opportunity to fund it from an outside source, I'll try to dig up that press release if I can and forward that to you.
And I guess with that, then Lance, if we could please remember to, I'm actually going to put that on the agenda then for next month, just to see it, just to get an update on that if there is something from the governor.
Sure. Understood, and I'll reach out to Phil as well to make sure that if Supervisor Robinson doesn't have that information, we'll do our best to find it.
Okay, other questions, other thoughts? So I guess what I'm hearing is we'll have the administrator go through the work plan and at least put some time frames to the items, and then I will have we'll provide the work plan to the executive committee for them to prioritize their top projects and provide that feedback. Let's move on to the potential additions to the work plan and the request by a supervisor for a possible detailed cost of each department based on statutory requirements. And so I throw it out for discussion. A couple of things that come to my mind is, you know, before we actually throw the responsibility of making the determination as to what programs are statutorily required, and is we have to, each of the committees have to determine the level of service that we want based on it. So a prime example, and I use this example when I look at it, statutorily we're required to provide infrastructure, roads, to each of the townships. At the same token, the infrastructure committee has had a discussion that says they want to maintain a 7 PACER rating. That's different than the statutory requirement. The statutory requirement says we have to have a road into each of the townships. So before you can actually ask the department and or administration to provide you a level of cost analysis for each program, priority-based budgeting is one of the tools that we have utilized in the past, even though we have some challenges with that, is that we have to set what our expectations are from each of the committees for the level of service, because that then is going to determine what the costs are. In other words, if we were to choose to lower our PACER rating to a 5 versus a 7, we would be able to then potentially, instead of doing a 30-mile reconstruct on or rebuild on 30 miles of county highway system roads each year, you could go to 20 and the cost would go down. But so I guess what I'm saying is I think there's a level of discussion that has to take place at the standing committees as far as statutory requirements and the level of service before we ever get to the potential analysis of cost versus statutory requirements. And because if you don't set the level of expectation, you can't set your level of cost. The other thing that I really see is there's a challenge, and the challenge is we have staff, and I see it as we're implementing our new ERP system that is just utterly taxing on the same personnel that we would need to add this requirement or requests to. These staff people are putting in 1.25 times what a normal person would be putting in, and to add additional work to them right now really would be challenging and would be almost unbearable for some, as I see it. But that's so I throw that, with that base level of knowledge, I throw it out for discussion to the executive committee. Supervisor Robinson.
We tried this before with priority-based budgeting, where we bought into the program, we went through an evaluation, we did many of the evaluations from, relied on the committees for input. And I think the failure of that system was garbage in, garbage out, and we didn't have good data. The problem that we have, and the reason we're going through the ERP process is Kayenta, as an accounting system, doesn't support many of these activities. And I just want to reiterate the chair's comments relative to the workload of our staff. We're in the process of transitioning both our accounting finance system and our HR system to a new system. We can't overload that group. I think this is a laudable goal on a long-term basis, and we ought to go back and revisit whether priority-based budgeting is the best mechanism or software or approach, or some other approach is it. But I think this year we have tapped out the resources of both the finance and HR, and if you want to do everything to fail, keep adding work to it. I think it's something that when the new system's in place, we'll have a better way of extracting some of those costs, but we don't have that right now.
Supervisor Langenhan, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you all know me, I'm a reasonable guy, kind of shy, doesn't really like to let others know what he thinks. But I will say this. I remember all the way back in 2018 when we had those discussions about priority-based budgeting. To Supervisor Robinson's credit, it was a garbage in, garbage out system. And the promise was that we were going to get this new data and we were going to implement that into the system and that we were going to have better data to make decisions off of. I certainly would like to see that project fulfilled. I really would. I will say this, and granted, I'm only human. I can only remember so much. But back in 2018, from what I remember, when we got those initial results back, we discovered that the overwhelming majority of obligations that we had as a county were statutorily required. Now, it could be that we had bad data and the numbers were, had a lot of statistical noise. But I think we already have a lot of that information available. Now, did we take on a lot more in the last couple of years? Sure, but I think that this is something that we can look at in the long term rather than the short term. The final point I want to make as a question in regards to maybe finding a middle ground, is there a way that by department you can look at the statutory requirements that they're all responsible for? And, even when I'm saying that, what was the point of orientation when we had the department heads come in and explain the work that they do? This is a difficult question. It's a difficult ask because I think that we have a lot of this information, but to make it usable requires a tremendous amount of resources on our behalf. It's also difficult because I really would like to hear that supervisor's reasoning behind this question, and I do wish they were here in front of us today. But just some thoughts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Boots, go ahead, please.
I guess my question would be, we have the priority-based budgeting out there right now, correct? Mm-hmm. That has that on there. Now, it has not been filled in lately, but you can say this is old data, 4 years old. The thing that you got to be careful of, and I agree with it 100%, I think you got to be careful just putting that out there the way it is, but what has to be put along with it is where are the cost savings with the non-statutorily required and how they're helping other programs, because I think where some supervisors are missing the boat lately is sometimes alternative programs save money even though they're not statutorily required. And what gets focused on a lot in NACO and WCA is here's what's working for us to try to get rid of some of this tax burden we have. We've found that this is working, or this is working, or this is working. If we're going to start moving away from that, it scares me, because the reality is you're not going to do things the way we did 20 years ago and keep up. So if we're going to just look at what's statutorily required, that's very narrow vision in my mind. I don't see what the problem would be with just saying, well, this is what was done 4 years ago, but take into account none of this was taken into account, like all the alternative programs that are helping these numbers. And we actually did that 4 years ago. No, correct. I agree with what the both supervisor said, garbage in, garbage out, because I think Chair Gibbs will remember me saying this. I think the only way we were going to get committees to do anything was, even if I feel even the most conservative people on the board are like, well, you're not, that's my committee, and that is needed. And that's what you found happening. Unless you would have said, you're going to have to find 10% to get out of here. I don't care how you do it, but this is what you're going to do. I don't know how you're ever going to get away from that, because every project, we've all been, like, 3 of us have been here how many years now? Have you ever seen a committee going, no, that's a junk program? No, we don't do that. We always find a way to say, well, that's working, or it's not working, but we'll work a little bit more, and then it just disappears. So, like you said, it's tough to do, but we have to look at the cost savings overall, in my mind. I guess that's, if they want the data, give them the data, but I wouldn't put any staff on it. I don't see why we're going to do that right now. We could do it, like we said, long term, but.
The other thing I would say is, I think once we have, the Kayenta, we all know is outdated. It's a 25-year-old program, and in order to actually provide meaningful information, even to finance, it is a struggle at best to be able to do a comparison of year-to-date to budget without having 1,400 different spreadsheets, because that's what it takes to get the data into Kayenta. Workday, the hope is, and I think at least everybody that has utilized it and utilized it for a length of time will tell you that the data is much more in a user-friendly atmosphere, and what you're going to be able to find is then you can use that information to each of the standing committees once Workday has been fully implemented. And finance could say, here now is some true financial picture of Department X or Department Y, or in budget versus actual. And then you've got some meaningful information to work from. So to use unmeaningful information or less than optimal information and making decisions on less than optimal information is not making sound decisions, in my opinion. So I'll leave it at that. Supervisor Langenhan, you had your hand up.
I was going to just make a comment, Mr. Chair, that I think this is something, I think this does present an opportunity with priority-based budgeting to go back to it. I think it presents an opportunity to go back and put in some good data. As far as the staffing capabilities, I mean, I'll trust the staff that if they are at a point where they have a lot of work on their plates right now with this implementation of the new program, sure, I get it. It's not going to be something that's timely. It's not going to be there tomorrow, but I think it's something that we can gradually work towards. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that now maybe finance has begun having some of these preliminary discussions, but, do we have numbers yet as far as what our budget is going to look like? I mean, we're still early in August.
Well, the preliminary numbers for net new construction came out from DOR last week. We know what that will result in. We do know we're going to get from HR Finance, we're going to get some information on our compensation study, so that will give us additional information. We've got some indications of where the sales tax and where our revenues will sit, but do we have all of those pieces in place? No. But we're working on, at some point we'll have some budget assumptions coming from finance and be brought to the full board for discussion. Supervisor Langen.
Just a final comment then, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Believe me, I'm all for fiscal conservatism, but making presumptions like this before we even have all the information available is fiscal mismanagement. Thank you.
Okay, Supervisor Leonard, or Supervisor Leonard, Administrator Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a pattern that happened yesterday as well. This is, I'm already carrying myself
supervisor?
a little differently. Yeah, I'm already, as an elected official, I carry myself differently. But thank you. Just a couple of thoughts. I want to reflect back. I think I've heard some good conversation, and it triggers a couple of thoughts for me. First, the idea of a level of service. my hope is, as a couple of supervisors have referred to, that we do really utilize our standing committee and our program committee system to look at level of service opportunities and actually look beyond just statutorily mandated services. I know the example that the chair provided relative to roads is certainly an illustrative one, but I mean, we have a lot of non-mandated services, to Supervisor Boots' point, that do positively impact the budget. At the same time, we have a lot of non-mandated services that we offer and deliver that cost money and don't generate offsetting revenue, but are nevertheless very, I believe, this is my inference, that I believe they're very popular programs, not only to the public, but also to supervisors. A simple example, parks. Parks are non-mandated. It would be, understanding what the level of service expectations are from each of the standing committees, not only on mandated services, but also on non-mandated, I think is a laudable discussion to have, even though I think everyone recognizes, and it's been said, that perhaps the data we have in our current system isn't where we want it to be. The second piece, I know that this committee has heard because I gave the spiel at each of the standing committees, but I think that it's important to note that there is there's an important staff role relative to the budget building process. We look to each of the standing committees and you all as elected officials to demonstrate and delineate, I should say, which programs and services you want us to provide. Staff having the capacity in terms of time to make sure the model of program delivery that we're choosing and the manner in which we're delivering it is the most efficient way to do so really is a solid return on investment. And I won't belabor the point. You've all heard me say this at the standing committee in terms of the examples. I'm really proud of the work that our health officer and her team have done looking at our nurse home visiting program, which we've used the Start Right model to deliver for decades. Based on direction from the board, we did that evaluation, and we're going to move forward with a model change, still delivering the nurse home visiting program, but the model is going to be a little bit different. And it's going to have a lot more access to data, which was important to the board, and also it's going to be more fiscally responsible. It's going to generate pretty significant savings. So, and we're doing those across the board and when we have capacity, but I would really welcome the opportunity if at the standing committee level to have those discussions about what is a level of service that each standing committee is looking for, regardless of whether it's mandated or non-mandated. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I think, you point out a great best practice. One of the Start Right program and some of the information that was brought back from even NACO helped to facilitate the discussion about, and the health officer has done a fabulous job at looking at that program and what is best practice throughout this country and how is that service delivered. And the potential, the discussions that we've had I've had with the administrator and the potential tax savings for implementation. But we also heard from the university study that the value of that program delivery is there. It's hard to quantify the actual dollars saved, even though it's not statutory required. So I think I think it's spot on. I think that we need to have those discussions at each of the standing committees as far as level of service, mandated or not. Other thoughts by the executive committee? Supervisor Langenhahn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm going to ask the question I think is probably on everybody's minds right now, which is what sort of timeline are we looking at? Because if I bring this back to ERC in September, is that going to be enough time to wrap this into the budget for this fall?
I would, it's going to be challenging, really challenging. I think we're really starting to have these initial discussions, my thought, and this is just my thought, and I'll throw it out to the rest of the committee, but if we come back, if you have in September, you have a discussion about potential change to a program, it might be something that would be potentially implementable in mid-year 2023 at best, but more specifically, more likely, a budget change for 2024. That's just my thought. Go ahead.
If I can add to that, Mr. Chair, I just want you to know the request I've made of department heads, Supervisor Longenhunt, I think speaks to your question. You know, as elected officials, what programs are we going to deliver at what level of service? And also the last piece of that three-legged stool in my mind is at what cost? So I've asked staff to start looking at what opportunities do we have to, you know, are there fees that haven't been examined in some time that are appropriate to be increased? And I think certainly Chair Gibbs's point that it might be a challenge to make substantial changes to certain programs at the start of the year. But I don't want to foreclose the discussion by saying, you know, there's not going to be value there. You could certainly, if there was a program that you wanted to have terminated, it's going to be unique to that situation in terms of what savings, if any, are going to be realized within that annual budget for 2023. So I'm not a very helpful answer, I know, but I think there is an opportunity on the fee side.
Supervisor Longenhunt, please.
Last comment. Mr. Chair, then how long will it take for this new Workday program to be implemented?
As we originally, when we first went down the road of implementation of Workday, the target start date was January 1 of 2023. We're running into challenges and staffing capacity. And so we may have to, because currently what's happening is we're running basically two programs side by side. We're running Workday right now in our financial network, and we're also running Kayenta. So they're doing duplicate work. But we may be having to push that back to first quarter of 2023, end of first quarter before Workday is fully operational. But again, the target date hasn't officially changed. It's still targeted for January 1, but we're running into some challenges with the consultant and staff capability, because the consultant's requesting multiple items from the same staff person that does it in a bigger environment. That would be two different departments, but in our setting, it's the same person, and they can't provide both information to the consultant. Go ahead.
Sure. Then to finish my comment is that in regards to whatever supervisor made this request of us, I hear them. This is something that I myself have been asking for years, and I was very excited when we engaged in priority-based budgeting all those years ago, and then we ran into that problem. I guess I would just end by saying that as soon as this Workday thing gets implemented and we can start to take a breath and hopefully spring, I really, really would like to see the county make priority-based budgeting a priority for this coming year. I really, really would. I feel like I've been saying that for years, but this is a perfect opportunity to address this individual's requests, and I think we could certainly do a lot of good in the long run with it. So I'm done talking today. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion? All right. I think we've had the consensus is that even we'll have the potential information to each of the standing committees that they begin to look at the level of service for mandated and non-mandated. But again, start that discussion early. It's not something that absolutely has to be on September's agenda, just depending, because it's going to take some time. But have those discussions so that we can have some meaningful input, hopefully, for the building of the 2024 budget. We've got to start early if we're going to be looking at transitioning various programs. Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I get my sense is, and it's difficult to get a good sense remotely, but that there is, as Chair Langenhan put more eloquently than I'm going to, that there is a desire to really have this, and as you put it, in 2024. Would that be helpful if I put it on that, the kind of prolonged, expanded work plan that we discussed previously?
I believe that would be helpful. I'll throw it out to the committee. What's their thoughts? Supervisor Langenhan.
Make me break my one rule. I hate to be responsible for adding something to the administrator's work plan, but it feels like this has been lingering for a very long time, and these questions keep coming up as far as what we're statutorily obligated to provide. I think it does need to be part of the long-term vision and part of the long-term work plan for the administrator. At least see it through to the very end so that, we can finish this project that sort of got started and was left by the wayside years ago. But thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Robinson.
One of the theme that comes to my mind is 50 Shades of Gray. When we start talking about a mandated service, there are so many different gradations of what is mandated. Only gray from the perspective of it's not clear. It is not clear as to what the expectations are. Law enforcement is mandated, is a bomb squad mandated, is a SWAT team mandated. And so I think part of the responsibility of clearing up that gray will be the committee's responsibility. So there are required services with gradations of what that looks like, and that's where the problem becomes. So it will be a workload for the committees to clarify what shade that is or what color it is, whether it's white, gray, or black. And so we've got some work relative to clarifying what is a mandate and understanding what that mandate means.
Another example would be, we're required to provide sheriff protection, but are we required to have 6 cars in the county at all times, or are we required to have 3? That's a level of service, and there's a level of cost that gets associated with that. And so that's a discussion that the committee has to take up. Do they want to continue to have 6 squads in the county at all times, understanding that Marathon County is the largest county in the state? But that's a level of service. To sit there and say we want to cut that cost to only 3 squads, well, that's fine, but that's a discussion for the committee. Supervisor Langenhan, go ahead.
Well, to your point, Mr. Chair, I can't cite a statute that says that the county shall provide public services for unincorporated areas or what have you. But, to John's point, I don't know if you can have meaningful discussions about level of service without understanding all the responsibilities that our staff have. So it's a chicken or the egg thing, right? So do we dedicate staff time to go and research the statutory requirements and then have the discussion about levels of service? Or do we just start having these broad discussions about service without actually knowing what our responsibilities are? That's the problem, right? So regardless, I'm happy to bring that back to ERC, more than happy to, but it's not going to be to the best ability of the committee to do so, because we're not going to be able to understand every single responsibility that we have.
So what I hear you saying is there's going to be an education level, and there's going to be an education component to each of the standing committees as far as, again, what is, if there is such a thing, and I don't know that there is, a base level of statutory requirement. I think that some things are more definitive than others. In child protection, it's very definitive into when we, it's maybe a judgment call by the social worker, but there's still, if they meet this criteria, the child must be taken and placed in protective service or protective custody. Other departments are not quite that clear. Prime example is what level of conservation practices do we have placed in. So I don't disagree with you. I understand the component. I think the component, though, is in context with that discussion about statutory requirements, because a statutory requirement's a statutory requirement. To say that, though, every program that the county runs is statutorily required is not the same as everyone is required to that level. So I think we'll have to have those discussions continually. Others? Supervisor Boots?
I think that's kind of what we started to do when we started the priority-based budgeting, because you remember going back to our committees and it would be, for instance, you'd walk back, well, this is not statutorily required, this program. We would have staff come in, because let's be honest, staff would be the educated ones telling us what that's for. And then we would listen to the staff and we'd say, okay, we understand why now we do or do not need that. And I guess that's where we run into the problem in my mind is staff ever going to come in, and I mean, in a program that they believe in, and they're going to give us the education, don't get me wrong, but are they ever going to tell us, yeah, there's some major problems with this program. I think it could go a different way. We would be fine. No, they're not going to do that. And that's the problem I find, because when we went through it, it was long, tedious meetings, listening to things like, Start Right. I didn't know what Start Right was when I first got on there. Now I know more than Start Right than I've ever wanted to know, and I get it. And you know what I mean? It was one of those. But it could be that way with every program. You're never going to kill your brainchild, I guess we'll call it, in my mind.
No, but I think we have set different expectations. At least in my mind, the administrator has set different expectations to each of the department heads, and those expectations, I think you're starting to see some of those results when you see the health officer bringing forward a potential $700,000 long-term year savings when the full implementation of Start Right, the revision of Start Right is in place. You're starting to see some of those discussions at the Parks and Rec Department on looking at trying to set fees and set up the parks system so that it's potentially long-term self-sustaining, at least not maybe from a capital standpoint, but from a standpoint of operational costs. So I think the administrators brought a different level of expectation to those department heads than we've had in the past. Supervisor Langenhahn.
I'll make 2 points. The first one is that I still think those conversations that we had back then were worthwhile, because I don't know how many of you remember, I believe that was the first steps to making some leaner choices with our nonprofit funding in the past. Correct. So the other point I wanted to make is that, as I mentioned, ERC, we're happy to have this, and we'll bring back, the discussion from our committee meeting, of course, but it doesn't feel genuine to if we actually had resources dedicated to this particular mission. So I don't want us to have these knee-jerk reactions during budget season because of one discussion that took place at one standing committee meeting. Third point I'll make, I know I only said 2, but if they're good managers, they should be letting you know what the problems are. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Supervisor Boots.
So that I find was part of the problem. The one thing I don't like, and I won't say the department heads I've said this to, but I've said, don't come into a meeting and tell me that everyone's 95% happy, because that's not correct. I don't care who you are. I don't want to hear rainbows and unicorns. I want to hear where the issues are. You're doing a great job. I can understand that, but there are going to be gaps no matter what. That, in my mind, that was some of the things in the past that I would have come forward. We have I won't say again, the department, we have a 98%. And I said, what are they calling about? And they told me, I'm like, no, there's no way that 98% of the people calling are saying they're happy. Well, what was it? Well, it was they would wait for 5 minutes and they could do a study after, like a research after the call. I'm like, well, if I'm angry at you, I'm not going to sit on the call and wait for 5 minutes to yell at something that's an automated machine and sit on the phone that I've been waiting on for 15 minutes. So those are the types of things. I mean, and I agree, there was some good things that came out of those. I just think there has to be maybe a little bit different approach, and I do agree with what Supervisor Gibbs said about the administrator pushing department heads a little bit more. Yeah, that could help, but I think we need to approach it maybe just a little differently than we did before.
Okay. Any other discussion? I think what we've heard is that we want to put this on the long-term horizon, because I do believe, and I do agree with Supervisor Long, and I mean, the priority-based budgeting, we didn't invest the dollars that we invested into that to not be able to utilize that tool. But to Supervisor Robinson's point, again, if we don't have meaningful data inside it, we need to make sure that that data is true and accurate before we start making those budget decisions or program decisions that are reactive, and we want to be reactive only to very accurate and up-to-date data. And so it's one of the challenges that we have, and obviously the COVID has complicated that to some extent, and then the ERP system changeover has also complicated it also. So with that, I will move on. Next meeting is scheduled September 8th at 3 p.m. That's a Thursday. Committee members are asked to bring ideas for future discussion. And we are down to item number 9. What is your pleasure? Supervisor Langen with a motion, Supervisor Robinson with a second. Any discussion? All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Say no. Motion is carried. We stand adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.